over time. But
you touched on it briefly.
Early last year, as the war was starting, the president of Rochester Institute of Technology, a man named Richard Rose, a retired Marine colonel, who had a high position in the Pentagon during Nixon's administration, he went on sabbatical, and he led people to believe that he was going off to join the forces which were at that time defending the United States. In one of those wonderful euphemisms, but in actual fact, he didn't go back into the military where everybody thought he was. About a month later, or 6 weeks later, it was found that he was at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, working. And this raised a lot of eyebrows and some concern, and a group got going on the campus to demand that he explain what he was doing working at the CIA when he had led people to believe that he was going to back into the military. And the people in Chicago went to Rochester and were involved in the formation of a coalition, CIA off-campus coalition there, which included faculty members and students and so forth. And they, through some very ingenious techniques, began to get documentation from the president's office. Among the documents they found were a memorandum of agreement signed by Rose, the president, and the CIA, which converted that institute into a virtual subsidiary of the CIA. In writing, the president gave the CIA a say in faculty appointments and in curriculum, if you can imagine. And there was a very close coordination with a journalist in the main Rochester newspaper. And she began to put the documents out in the newspaper. And this went from one item to another, including the CIA's secret financing of an innocuously named subdivision of RIT called the Federal Programs Research Project. That was a wholly CIA thing. And they were doing research, for example, into how to manufacture furniture with cavities for hiding things in the furniture, like bugs. Also picture frames for electronic listing devices and things like that. And these were like 30 or 40 students and faculty, all with CIA security clearances doing this secret work. They also did so-called research projects, which were also secretly financed by the CIA. One of them, which was exposed, was a research program which produced a document called Change Masters. And this was an analysis and presentation on the role of U.S. intelligence in the 1990s and beyond. And it was like giving a new raison d'etre for the CIA now that the Soviet threat has receded, and or receded. And the main thrust of it was the need for economic intelligence from all around the world and economic espionage. Then there was another document which was even more shocking called Japan 2000. And this was this racist report on Japanese culture, which presented Japan as the threat to U.S. national security in place of the Soviet Union, and which I think I mentioned last night predicted a surprise Japanese economic attack on the United States. The war has already begun, or something like that, as they ended that report. And that caused a huge fuss in Japan, because it was a government report which was secretly commissioned by the CIA, and was going to be held closely, but that also got out and was in the newspapers. Well, the controversy went on for about 6 months. It had different phases, and in the end there was an official investigation by an outsider, a well-known lawyer who conducted it with an assistant lawyer, and they looked into the CIA connections in some depth. And before their report was even ready, in November, the president of Rochester Institute of Technology was forced to resign. That was in early September, about 6 months after the whole thing had started.
Can I interrupt you? Was the CIA off-campus movement responsible for getting his resignation?
Oh yes, oh yes.
What part did
The entire...
give us some case study of, so we can say, well, you know, sort of learn from what they
Well,
do.
if you could do something like
Enthusiasm
that
for
here,
what
or
they
that
did.
can be repeated all over the country, it would be a wonderful thing. But it took the information first, the research, and to see what was actually happening there. And through the Chicago people, you can get into some of the techniques that were used there to get the documentation.
We can't even get our class schedules right, I mean.
Here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work to do, but it was the combination of energy on the faculty and student and community level in Rochester, plus the ingenious techniques they came up with for getting the documentation into their hands and then getting it out into the local media. That was the secret of success of what happened there.
Bill, once that was disclosed in the media, did the community react? Did they become supportive?
There was a split. In Rochester, the result of all this was that some people, of course, said, as one would expect, that, well, what's wrong with the CIA coming onto this campus? But the fact is that Rochester Institute of Technology was at the same time a recipient of Japanese largesse, for example. They had millions of dollars coming in, and they're trying to get more from Japanese companies, at the same time that they were secretly doing this report for the CIA, which called the Japanese an ageless, amoral, creatures of an ageless, amoral culture, and so forth and so on, which was totally racist. And that is one of the reasons, of course, it caused such a fuss in Japan. And Rose himself, before he resigned, he went to Japan to actually apologize in person for the content of that report. But RIT, that example is in this Covered Action Information Bulletin on the CIA in Academia, which is not very old. It's just from about September or October of last year. And I hope somebody has a copy of that. I saw a CAIB there. Is that the one? Yeah, that's Rose on the cover right there. And the whole bulletin is about this area of the CIA in academia. The RIT example is very well drawn up there, but there's one on Harvard also as one of the principal universities used by the CIA to support their activities. The way to look at it, I think, is that the CIA sees the universities and colleges in the United States as absolutely necessary for them to do their work. It is a way to get people in. It's a pipeline for personnel to come in. And that's where this National Security Education Act of 1991 is so important. I didn't mention this, I don't think, in my talk last night. I did over at Pitt. But Congress approved a bill last year called the National Security Education Act of 1991, which provides $150 million, if you can imagine, in startup money for a whole program of activities designed to keep the national security state going over the next 10 years or longer. This includes scholarships for people who want to go into the national security field. It's to get the hewers of wood and the porters of water, you know, for the next generation in these agencies, especially in the CIA, but not exclusively. There are going to be scholarship programs. They're reaching down into the high school level to get people involved. And their purpose is to provide the functionaries or the officers and staff for these agencies in the years ahead. But not exclusively there either, because they also want, through this program, to get people on the faculties of colleges and universities around the country who will conduct courses in this area. And so it's one more way of penetrating academia in the United States in order to serve their own purposes. That would be from high school to the graduate student level. And a publication like the Covered Action Information Bulletin, which came out just now, which we didn't have copies of, but you can get in. You have a local left-wing bookstore here or progressive bookstore that handles publications on the left, like In These Times and CAIB, and you do. Well, try to get a copy of the most recent bulletin, which came out, I think, in January. And there you will find an article on this National Security Education Act of 1991. That is something, of course, to be up on, because as that program gets developing, they will certainly try to install it here. And it's something to oppose. It's like the CIA Officer in Residence program. That is a program wherein the CIA tries to place on the faculties of universities and colleges serving officers to teach and to recruit and to serve, as they say, as role models, if you can believe it, for students. And they have about 15, I would think, at this point, around the country. One is at George Washington University, one is at the Kennedy School of Government, at Harvard. They're in different places. One at the University of Texas, I think. But they won't even say publicly where these people are. They cannot keep it a secret on the campus, so it's something you always want to be aware of, and that is they want to place these people on the campuses. One of the other victories last year was at the University of Seattle, a Jesuit school, where in June, as everyone was about to leave for the summer, they announced that they were accepting a CIA officer in residence. And keep in mind that the CIA continues to pay the salary of this person when they go on the faculties. So it means that the agency gets a free professor. I mean, the university gets a free professor. He was going to teach modern Chinese history. And during the summer, some of the Jesuit community there are only about 27, I think, on the faculty at Seattle University out of a total staff of something like 700. But they run the school. And so some of them were opposed to the acceptance of a CIA officer because of the CIA's support to the Salvadoran death squads and military that murdered the Jesuits in 1989, those 6 Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter. And so they had a meeting after people came back from the summer in September, and the president decided that he would not have a split in the community because some of the members said, we will leave this place if that man comes. And in fact, he had already come. He had come and he bought a house and brought his family. And the week before he was to start classes, the appointment was canceled. And that was partly due to support from the people at Rochester in their coalition, as well as people from Chicago who went out there and helped establish a coalition there. And they were working not only with people at the University of Seattle, but also the University of Washington, which is right there too in Seattle. So it's something to keep in mind all the time, that there's no reason or need, in fact just the opposite, for isolation. I mean, between this university and Pitt there should be very close coordination, and especially when it comes to action. And here I mean CD, because there's no need for a student at this university to go do CD and become subject to disciplinary procedures here. I mean, there are students at Pitt who would do it and not be subject to the disciplinary procedures here.
I've been arrested at SCI twice, and I got beheaded.
Yeah. Well, the people who are not enrolled at the moment, too, can be quite helpful in this. Yeah. Well, always the community people are quite important, and I've never seen one of these efforts work really well unless there is participation on all 3 levels, the faculty, students, and community people. It always works best that way. And that's why it's important to bring community people into the meetings. I was quite pleased to see community people there last night because they are here permanently, and faculty members are here for many more years than students normally are. So they are something that keeps these things going as the student population comes and goes. Quite important to have them involved.
Do you have any insights to the Mellon family and their connection with the CIA and...
Yeah, well, SCAFE is one of the principal people involved there, and the SCAFE Foundation. That also has been...
Dick Scaife?
Yes.
His name Dick Scaife?
Yeah. You can find information on the participation with the CIA in different activities in the Covert Action Information Bulletin. And in that bulletin, for example, that you have there, on the back cover, inside back cover, there is always a list of the principal articles from previous issues, going all the way back to the beginning when we started that in '78. And you'll find, I imagine there somewhere, you'll see SCAFE's name probably at one point. But there's plenty of information that's out on how the foundation has helped in these types of activities.
Well, I remember during, I guess, the Angolan War, the Gulf Oil Company and the CIA were working hand in hand. And of course, Mellon Bank is Gulf Oil. So there was that tie, there was sort of that obvious tie back then. But I'm just sort of wondering, if you can give us any insights into how to approach the power structure. I mean, it's Carnegie Mellon University, and it's, Mellon pretty much pulls the political strings around Pittsburgh. So I'm just wondering if you could get...
Well, my advice is to read this up on the in the Covert Action Information Bulletin. Get the back issues and read them, and establish a library here, or get your library here to get back issues and do the study. Because of course I've read all this in the past, but I can't. Yeah, I'm sorry that I can't cite chapter and verse right now because I haven't done the reading recently. But I can assure you there's a lot that's already come out. And the current Covert Action Information Bulletin from January is entirely devoted to the organizations which support the goals of the CIA abroad, from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to the National Endowment for Democracy, and on and on. And it's a very good issue to show how broad this foreign intervention is, in which the CIA is participating, but not alone. And the National Endowment for Democracy is something that everybody should be aware of, because they were doing things now openly, like political intervention in elections and so forth. I think it's calculated that NED spent something like $10 or $12 for every vote in the Nicaraguan elections in 1990 when Chamorro was elected. So,
is this an American government agency?
Yes, it's supposedly a private foundation, but it isn't at all. It gets all its money, millions and millions of dollars, from the Congress. And it works through several different institutes, one of the AFL-CIO, one of the Democratic Party, one of the Republican Party, and it also gives grants directly. But it is a way of getting dirty money laundered, and supposedly openly. But in actual fact, they are not all that open about all of their activities. And they spent millions of dollars in the Soviet Union.
The
National Endowment for Democracy, NED. And you will find a lot in the Covert Action Information Bulletin on what they do and what they did in Nicaragua, for example. Or you can find it in Z Magazine also. It's just a matter of doing the study and doing the research. Anyone have a comment to make?
Also, is there someone who's like taking that list with the names on it? Who will...
Where is the list? Tatsu has it.
You have the list?
Well, I don't need to see anything.
I would think that one of you every one of you should have a copy of it. Someone should perhaps make copies. How many are we here today anyway? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It's a good turnout. I'm happy that so many have come. Abroad, which was designated to be the Soviet Union. And what I failed to mention last night, I think, was that when this decision was made in 1950 to rearm in the United States and for the U.S. to finance the rearmament of Western Europe and this military economy that started then and that we still live with today, there was no threat from the Soviet Union. The Soviets were still digging out of the rubble of World War II. They'd lost 20 million people. And they were no threat at all, but there had to be a justification for this rearmament for economic purposes, a so-called Keynesian militarism. And the Soviet Union was then created as a threat. And it was because the United States and Western Europe became a threat to them that they had to then join the arms race, which eventually drove them broke. The CIA's job was, of course, to assess the threat from the Soviet Union, and they overestimated all through the years. And their estimates were taken seriously by the Congress, which then voted far more funds for U.S. defense over many years than they had to, because the threat from the Soviets were overblown. Well, this is the problem of politicized intelligence. And this was very much in the news during the Gates confirmation hearings, where CIA officers former and serving, went on public record before the committee, the Senate committee, describing cases in which Gates demanded that, or Casey demanded that a particular Soviet estimate come out a certain way, rejecting what the best estimate of the analysts were. And this was especially true in what was known as the Soviet analysis division. So I think that it's a mixed thing as far as the intelligence production through the years has been. Certainly the CIA missed the breakup of the Soviet Union. They didn't realize what was going on. They didn't anticipate it either. And at the same time, they were working to try to foment the disintegration of the Soviet Union. They've been doing that for many years. And Jack Bloom, who was the counsel to the Kerry Subcommittee on Drugs and Narcotics, some of you may be aware of what this subcommittee has done through the years to try to expose the or to get into the possible U.S. government, including CIA, knowledge or action against the drug trade. And Bloom, for one, has stated that he believes that the CIA was putting millions upon millions of dollars through the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, this corrupt bank, and the money was going out to the nationalist movements in the Soviet Union to try to, and various other activities, to try to foment regionalism and nationalism, which would weaken the unity of the Soviet Union over many years. And certainly the radios that the CIA had set up around 1950, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, they were always fomenting divisions. So certainly the CIA had something to do with it. And Bush, at that speech in Washington, where he denounced me by name, this is the one in October at the banquet, black tie banquet in Washington, as part of his speech he did denounce the naysayers, the critics of the national intelligence system, and particularly of the CIA. And he said something to the effect that no one knows how important the CIA's work was in the developments that have occurred, meaning the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist governments in Eastern Europe. So that's the action side, though, as opposed to intelligence collection. And your question was on intelligence collection, and I think that it just depends on what we're talking about. Schwarzkopf, I think, complained about the quality of intelligence, particularly tactical intelligence, during the war. Whether his complaints are justified is anybody's guess. But in fact, the CIA, from 1982 on, you know, the Iran-Iraq war started about 1979, I think, when Iraq invaded Iran. And Iran was practically defeated at the beginning. And that's when the Reagan-Bush administration, as soon as they came into office, they began selling arms through the Israelis, which amounted to billions upon billions of dollars worth of arms. And it was all secret. And it was part of the deal for keeping the hostages until after the election of 1980. Then the war swung in favor of Iran because of that, and the U.S. began helping the Iraqis. And the latest I've read on this out of Washington is that this assistance to Iraq began in 1982. And that included intelligence from the CIA of the highest quality, from satellites and so forth, and monitoring. And they could give the Iraqis the information on the movements of Iranian military units, and that saved Iraq from collapse. Because they did not want Iran to win, they did not want Iraq to win. They were helping both sides, and they wanted to see a stalemate in the end. And that's, I think, what they got. So that type of intelligence, of course, was useful for the policy of preserving the Hussein regime, because they were afraid that if Iran won, that Iraq would then go fundamentalist, and that they didn't want either.
So
Yes?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I noticed there are no references to anybody's name that I looked quickly in the Iran-Contra in one of your books. Do you write about such connections and they all get censored out? I mean, are there people you're not allowed to write any words about, like George Bush or Ronald Reagan and so on?
No, I didn't have association with those people, and I haven't included them. But the CIA, over 10 years, more than 10 years now, since I have had this federal court injunction requiring me to submit all my writings for censorship, and I've been doing it, they have not been able to censor a single word. in the book I'm writing right now, they have tried to censor various passages, and each time they did, this was at the beginning, a couple of years ago when I started it, I then documented those passages through already published works. I simply footnoted the passages that they tried to censor, and then they had to back down. I got tired of that because they were doing it with each batch of stuff that I sent in. I do all this through my lawyer in New York City. And so in order to stop that, I called Mel on the telephone, my lawyer, once. And I said, Mel, look, I'm going to do less and less footnoting so that they will censor more and more. And I'll have the footnotes already done to add later, so they'll have to back down. But when we publish the book, then we'll publish all those passages in bold as proof that the CIA tried to censor them as classified information. They haven't tried since then to censor a single thing. That means they're monitoring the telephone, of course, and decided that they didn't want to have a whole book full of passages which were confirmed as being true because they tried to censor them as classified.
Can you use some sort of, in the event that you hadn't been able to succeed with that sort of thing, could have you done something where someone else would write a book of conversations with you?
Yes. You're talking about the Salvador book, or not?
I mean,
oh.
I haven't read it.
Oh, well...
is that a strategy that could work for people like you?
Yes, yes. There is an exception to the rule, and because this is all based on a CIA policy, right? And it is based on the secrecy agreement that everyone signs as a condition of employment. You have to promise in writing that you will never reveal any of the classified information of what the CIA does, and that if you want to write or speak about the agency or intelligence generally, that you will submit anything you want to say or write for prior agency approval. They call it pre-publication review. In fact, it's censorship. And the exception to this is extemporaneous remarks on matters of public concern, but without revealing classified information. And so you can do this in conversations or interviews with journalists, for example, or television or print journalism. And a lot of people do it all the time. And they have to take you to court, you know, if they want to get action against you. And there are, let's see, how many of us are under injunction right now? Victor Marchetti was the first. I didn't get an injunction for many years and didn't submit a single thing for approval because I wasn't under the jurisdiction of any U.S. court. I mean, they don't go in criminal procedures, that is, criminal actions against people for not submitting. They go to the court to get a permanent injunction. That's a court order making you do it. And the first was against Victor, then against John Stockwell, against Frank Schnepp. They published books without submitting them to the CIA for approval or for censorship. And I think that's about it. We're four, I guess, now that have the injunctions. And the only reason I have an injunction is that I sued the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act. And as soon as I sued them, they came back with what is known as a counterclaim in the name of the United States for the injunction. And they got it. And so even though I had submitted myself, in other words, to the jurisdiction of the court, even though I was living abroad, where they had no jurisdiction. But by initiating the lawsuit against them, then the court accepted the counterclaim for the injunction. But in fact, I got some very good stuff under the Freedom of Information Act, and it was worth it. And I don't mind submitting the stuff. I mean, I don't have any contact with the agency. I just send it to my lawyer, and he sends it to them, and then they notify him that it's okay. And as I say, not one word has been censored all these years, because they know perfectly well that I can document every single thing I say, because I'm not on the inside getting information from the CIA anymore. I'm picking up what leaks out of Langley, and that is considerable. It's enough, you know, to know what they're up to. Well, what about another meeting? You want to discuss that among yourselves to figure out when you might get another meeting?
On. No capiche.
You know I like Vince, because he doesn't smell like other activists.
This does not smell like other activists.
Unless this is an advertisement for...
Okay. Well, here we are once again at Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Military University. My name's Vince Irene, and this is Tatsu
Tatsuya Keita.
Tatsuya Kato. The 60s meets the 90s. Today we're here with Philip Agee, and student activism is just busting out all over. In fact, it's so incredible, I think, that it should be in the now famous periodical in Pittsburgh. But activism here at CMU is deader than dead, and Tatsu and I have been commissioned by God to resurrect Lazarus from the tomb.
Yes, and I've had the chance to bring Philip Agee. Philip Agee is an ex-CIA secret operations officer who worked extensively in Latin America. And since then, he has come in from the cold, as he says, and speak out against the CIA. But more importantly, he has promoted student activism, and he realizes that the only place the CIA can be physically confronted is on college universities and campuses across the nation. So, with that...
Well, it's really interesting, but because here at Carnegie Mellon University, besides the millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military contracts, also is the CIA recruiting on a regular basis here. And I think that since the movie has come out, JFK, tying in the different secret organizations that were responsible for his murder and the end of that era and the beginning of a new government, of a government dominated by the military, academic, industrial community, I think that Philip has hit upon a new strain of activism that we didn't see here at Carnegie Mellon. Philip has been very encouraging to us. Unlike other people who have quit the CIA, who have quit the Pentagon, I think that he's not pointing to himself, but he's pointing to, as Tatsu said, the only nexus, the only crossroads that we have with the CIA, and that's on college campuses. Obviously, this is not the 60s, and it's going to take a lot of creativity and a lot of stimulating people's imagination to bring people out, but for some reason, author Philip Agee has done that in the last 24 hours, and we're going to be talking to him a little bit this morning about focusing a little bit on Iraq, the present situation that doesn't seem to go away, with over 750 children a day under the age of 5 dying because of the sanctions. The sanctions that we have on Iraq is our way of extending the war, as our sanctions on Vietnam 16 years later is our way of punishing what our country perceives to be our enemies. And hopefully, you know, as the years go on, we will put an end to this murderous empire. It's about Iran, Iraq, and Contragate, and the Iraqi war, and the future of all that.
Hold on a second. What are you talking about here?
Well, we want to give it a half hour, but I don't think we're going to have that much. We have a lot of other footage, so we don't need a half hour, right?
Well, let's see how it goes.
Yeah, we're talking about a half hour.
All right, let's go.
Okay. You say when?
Yeah, talking in the mic.
Today we have Philip Agee with us here at Carnegie Military University, and Philip has agreed to this interview. Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Hold the microphone that close to him. Just
Okay.
Okay.
Say when.
Okay. When?
Sure. So you quit the CIA in '68? Okay. Today we're with ex-CIA agent Philip Agee here at the now famous Carnegie Military University. Philip Agee quit the CIA in 1968. He wrote a very controversial book, one of the first, exposing the CIA, called Inside the Company. Philip Agee, since then, has written several books, but unlike a lot of people who dropped out in the 60s who are now famous, Philip spends a lot of his time encouraging student activism. especially with the CIA. That's our only nexus. That's the only place that our paths will cross. The CIA is their attempts to recruit the best and the brightest. Here at Carnegie Mellon University, the CIA periodically has been here recruiting and periodically has been confronted. What is really unique about our present situation is the movie JFK, which has stimulated a lot of young minds who were not even born when Kennedy was assassinated. So there was a lot of curiosity about his talk last night. A lot of people attended the seminar this morning trying to establish a group called CIA off campus. And this morning we're going to be talking to Philip a little bit about what has brought a resurgence of student activism, and that's the crisis in the Middle East, the Iraqi war. First, we're going to start, though, back to the CIA's involvement with Iran and Iraq. Philip, we're going to sort of concentrate on, focus on this. We could talk about a lot. Unfortunately, the empire has been involved in countless areas and is presently, but we're going to talk a little bit about Iran and Iraq and the Iraqi war today. Could you give us a little bit of background about the CIA's involvement with Iran and Iraq?
Well, where Iraq is concerned, there was a coup in which the CIA was involved. I believe it was around 1963. And this was the overthrow of a government at that time which was a left-wing government, and which brought the Ba'athist party to power, and Saddam Hussein, although he didn't start out as chief of state. He became chief of state later. So the agency had a role in the coming to power of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Of course, the Iranian situation was rather different. There, the CIA had joined with the British and overthrew an elected democratic regime of the 1950s over Iranian oil. It happened that the Iranian government had nationalized the British concessionary company known as Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951. And the nationalization was a result of the British refusal to renegotiate the concession which they had received around 1900. They had a monopoly on all of Iranian oil, and at that time in the early 50s, Iran was one of the top producers in the world, if not the principal producer. And so the British came to the United States then and asked the CIA to organize a coup to overthrow that nationalist government under Mossadegh. And they did it. The grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, his name was Kermit Roosevelt, a CIA officer. He was the head of operations for the Middle East. He's written a book on this called Operation Ajax. In about 19 days or 20 days in August of 1953, he organized a coup which overthrew the government and which put the Shah in as a virtual military dictator. And in the aftermath, the CIA, with Israeli support, organized the SAVAK secret police in Iran. And this was the instrument which kept the Shah of Iran in power for 25 years. The CIA had trained them, they had supported them all through the years, and of course the SAVAK became very well known around the world during those 25 years for its torture chambers and for its assassinations of the Shah's political opponents. Coming a little bit closer to the present, you know that or perhaps you don't know, but during the 1970s, the Shah of Iran convinced the CIA to foment a rebellion in Iraq by arming and supporting the Kurdish nationalist movement under Mustafa Barzani. And for several years, the CIA poured in millions of dollars. I think the operation cost in the end about $17 million. And this was a revelation of the House of Representatives investigation of the CIA, 1975-76. The dispute was over the Shatt al-Arab, the border between Iran and Iraq. And the Shatt al-Arab is an estuary of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, about 100 miles long. And for generations, the border between the two countries had been on the Iranian shore. But the Shah of Iran wanted the border switched to the shipping channel in the middle, and the Iraqis refused. And that was the reason why the Shah wanted the CIA to foment this rebellion. And it was successful, so much so that by 1975, at the OPEC meetings of chiefs of state in Algeria, the Shah and Hussein met, and Hussein conceded that the border be moved to the shipping channel away from the Iranian shore. That was one of the justifications given by Hussein to redress that humiliation, you might call it. That was one of the justifications for the invasion of Iran by Iraq in 1979. It happened also that back in the 1970s, I think it was the week, if not days, after the agreement or the Iraqi concession to Iran, that the CIA cut off all support to the Kurds and left them to be ground up by the Hussein military because they ran out of ammunition, they ran out of all sorts of support.
So the Kurds being abandoned presently isn't a new situation?
Not at all new, and they know this history is, they lived it, their families lived it. And as a result of the CIA cutoff, immediate cutoff of support to the Kurds, something like 15 or 20,000 of them were forced to become refugees, and many had to flee to Iran or to Turkey or other places. And of course many were murdered by the Iraqi military under Hussein. This was, as I said, one of the justifications or one of the backgrounds to the Iraqi invasion of Iran in 1979. And right at the beginning, in 1981, the Reagan-Bush administration began selling what amounted to or became billions of dollars worth of arms secretly to Iran to bolster the regime there, the Khomeini government, because Iraq was about to defeat them. And the United States policy was that neither side should win. And once they had sent all these billions of dollars of arms to Iran, then the Iranians began to win the war. And by around 1982, the United States began to support the Iraqis. And just recently it has come out in the press that the CIA was called upon to give the best possible intelligence to the Iraqis on the movements of Iranian military units, beginning as early as 1982 and continuing on through the 1980s until the end of the war. So it turns out the United States was supporting both sides in the Iran-Iraq war, hoping that it would become a stalemate, that neither side would win, because both possibilities were undesirable, that the Iranians win or that the Iraqis win. And that is exactly what happened.
So in terms of being in control, the way the United States through the CIA has kept in control with Iran and Iraq is just to make sure that their economy is drained, that their morale is drained, that they're constantly at war with each other, that no one is winning. I mean, what you're saying here is that we're depending on the exhaustion of a war to make sure that nobody has a foothold in the Middle East.
Well, Western policy in the Gulf has always been to keep it divided. They never wanted to see any government exercise hegemony in the Persian Gulf. And I think that is one of the principal reasons why the Bush administration went to war against Iraq, because with the Kuwaiti petroleum reserves, Hussein would have controlled nearly as much of the known resources of petroleum as the Saudis. I believe with the resources of Kuwait, Hussein would have had something like 21% of the world's known petroleum resources. And that is getting up there to where the Saudis are, with something like 24%, if I'm not mistaken. And that was just too much of the world's known resources of petroleum in the hands of a radical nationalist regime. That is the reason why the United States went to war. But of course, there's something that precedes that, and in my feeling or my analysis, I believe that the United States policy was to have Hussein believe that he could take over Kuwait with impunity. All the signs are there, especially the transcripts of the April Glaspie meetings with Hussein just before the war began. That's the U.S. ambassador who went into Hussein and told him, I've been instructed by my government, by the president, to seek better relations with Iraq. And she also said the United States policy is that we do not have an opinion on Arab-to-Arab disputes. especially your dispute with Kuwait, she says. And that was as much as telling him that he could move against Kuwait if he wanted to, and the United States would not intervene. There were various reasons for this, one of which I think was to continue the specter of a foreign threat to United States national security. And this was at a time when the Soviet Union was crumbling.
So you don't believe that April Glaspie acted on her own?
Of course not. I'm sure that as soon as she knew she was going to have an appointment with Hussein, she got instructions from Washington, and she said so. It's in the transcript that I have been instructed by the president, I have been instructed by my government, and so forth. And this is normal procedure, that when an ambassador is going to meet with the chief of state, she immediately informs the Department of State, and they then determine what the content of the meeting should be and what the ambassador should tell. And naturally, the communications are instantaneous. It's not as if there's a long delay in that. And so it can be done in a matter of hours, really, assuming that the people in Washington are available, and of course they are.
You know, it's no news to anyone that we had no news about the war in the Gulf, and that the media was sort of cheerleaders for the system. Starting with Grenada, it seems like the media really gave up its role of being investigative reporters, of questioning our government. I mean, why do you think that the media, who traditionally as a secondary institution of our society, as people who gather information, as communicating, why do you think the media has given up its role of being an adversary of the government?
Well, I think that this has been very well documented and established in a number of books. Ben Bagdikian, for example, in The Media Monopoly, was one of the most effective in this analysis of corporate control of the public information media in the United States. One of the books that was on the table last night is the book by Marty Lee and Norman Solomon, Unreliable Resources, or Unreliable Sources. And the situation is that I think something like 23 corporations control the entire public information media in the United States. Some very big ones like General Electric owning NBC, for example. But all the magazines and newspapers and radio stations and television are run by 23 corporations which have interlocking directorates and so forth, and they naturally have an identification with government policies. They are a part of government in terms of the consensus of what is good for the United States and what people should know, what they should not know, especially in determining what is news and what isn't. That's where the censorship comes in. And it's automatic. You know, they don't have to have a Ministry of Information telling them what to say. They know what they should say and what they shouldn't.
It's really interesting. During the beginning of the war, there was over 3,000 people arrested for civil disobedience against this government's warring policies. And during the whole war, there was over 6,000 people arrested, which was more. This was a more concerted effort, more orchestrated effort than we ever saw during Vietnam. In the 60s, there was a saying, if it isn't on film, then it hasn't happened. And I think some of us have really bought that about the media. If we don't see it on TV, that somehow that we're not being effective or we're not really reaching out to people. And so for most people who are student activists, for most of us from the 60s, we're dealing with a lot of despair and depression, a real lack of morale. But it's sort of a cyclical thing that the media tells us there's no one out there, and then there comes the breakdown of the left and the peace movement having an identity crisis. I mean, do you think that as a movement against oppressive governments, do you think that we're going through an identity crisis? Do you think that we've been relying too much on the media to be encouraged?
Well, I can tell you this. I came, I live in Hamburg in Germany, and I came over for about 8 weeks in the spring last year, beginning just as the war was coming to a close. And I think I had about 35 meetings in 45 days, and they were all over the country. And I saw a lot of discouragement and so forth on that trip, because I was talking to people, of course, at these public meetings who had been out there marching, trying to prevent the war. And there was plenty of time to prepare, the movement to stop the war. I mean, we all know that something more than half of the population, according to the polls, were opposed to the beginning of the war. That didn't make any change in the Bush policy, because he had decided early on that there was going to be a war, and they would not let the sanctions do what they were supposed to do, force him out of Kuwait. And I think for people who oppose the war, there is, of course, a disappointment. That's an emotional thing. But discouragement, no. It is simply clear that the people don't run the government of the United States. It doesn't represent the interests of people. And in this Gulf War policy, as well as in the permanent military economy that we've had now since 1950 or so, that this has not been in the interests of the vast majority of the people of the United States. The national security has been defined over all these years in the interests of the very few, the elites who really control the United States and who have all through the generations since the country was established.
Well, with this breakdown of democracy and with the fact that we dropped more bombs on Iraq in 43 days than we did in Vietnam in 10 years. It seems like what we need now is preemptive strikes for peace. We need something that is going to prevent our country from doing this again, because we had 10 years to wear down the government until they actually lost the war in Vietnam. Of course, the war continues through the sanctions we have on Vietnam. And so my question to you is that in an era of accuracy and precision, and sort of like the arms race has been replaced by a technology race, I mean, how can we ever hope to prevent the next war returning to Iraq, what has happened in Panama, the possibility of going into Libya, going into Cuba? How can we ever hope to prevent the next war?
Well, first I'd like to comment on what you said about the breakdown of democracy, because I don't think that we've ever had a real democracy in this country, and anyone who studies the adoption of the Constitution will understand quite clearly that democracy, as we understand it today, was the last thing that the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. In fact, they wrote out of the political process 95% of the people who lived in the United States at that time. So democracy was not the purpose of the Constitution to begin with. It was to establish strong central authority responding to elitist interests in the United States. That's private property. And those men who wrote the Constitution were the representatives of the elite. They were the lawyers, the bankers, the merchants, the landowners, the slaveholders, and so forth. And they wrote the Constitution in their own private interests. That is the way government has served ever since. And that is the reason why there is so little democracy in the United States now. That is why we have the phenomenon of about only half of the people eligible to vote actually voting in national elections. They are the others who don't vote understand that their vote is not going to make any difference. So what do we do in the United States now to prevent the next war? Well, first of all, realize that in the months ahead, in 1992, it's very possible that Bush, seeing his possibility for re-election dimming, will seek some kind of military action abroad to rally the country around him and get himself re-elected. That is one of the things we have to be on guard for and to be organized to prevent to the degree that we can. Countries like Cuba, for example, they are quite aware of this possibility, of this danger, and they are not going to fall for provocations which would justify a Bush military attack against them. But one can see already in the pronouncements of the Bush administration that they are preparing public opinion for some kind of military action, whether against Iraq to try to finally eliminate Hussein and his power, or against Libya in connection with the Pan Am airliner bombing, or against Peru for the narco-trafficking and the growth in strength of Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, that's the Maoist guerrilla movement, or against Colombia for the things that are happening in there. There is all this possibility that the narco-terrorism or the war against the drug trade in the Andean countries can be more militarized. It's already being militarized, and there are more than 100 U.S. Green Berets in Peru alone right now. That's double the number that has been allowed.
Where can we further read about what's going on in Peru?
I would suggest the November issue of Z Magazine. There's a very good article in that magazine about the militarization of the war against the drug trade in Peru, and how that is serving as a cover for military operations against the guerrilla movement. That would be the best article, I think.
Okay, so not to be redundant or pushy, but how do we prevent the next war?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I knew the answer to that, we'd do it. I don't think there is one particular answer to that. I think people have got to stay aware, stay informed, stay organized. I was very sorry, really, to see the collapse of the coalitions that were built up to stop the Gulf War, because no sooner had the war ended than they began to fall apart. Although some of the groups did try to stay together. For example, Ramsey Clark and that organization have held hearings in lots of different countries, including the United States, on war crimes committed as a part of the U.S. coalition's program against Iraq, particularly the targeting of civilian areas and the targeting of the infrastructure, which wiped out the whole electrical grid in Iraq, meaning then that they had no water purification, no sewage treatment, and no hospital energy at times. It was very bad, and that is the reason why so many children under 5, for example, the Harvard team that went there in the spring of last year, I think it was May, they predicted that something like 170,000 children in Iraq under the age of 5 would die within the coming year for lack of proper medical care, lack of sanitation, and so forth. These are war crimes. This is like genocide, practically. And so Ramsey and the group around him have continued this, and they've held hearings, for example, in Spain. They've held them in various countries, and they are going to be presenting an entire report on these findings in the course of 1992. So that's an encouraging sign. But how to stop the next war is really a very difficult thing. It takes organization. And one of the lessons that they drew from the war in Vietnam was that military action, except under special circumstances, such as the Gulf War, where they could get 33, I think, different nations into a coalition under the UN sponsorship, but that was simply a cover for a U.S. operation, naturally. In other actions, such as in Panama and Grenada, they've had to do it very fast and with overwhelming firepower and with all of this high-tech destructive capacity. And they were successful in doing it and ending it before any protests could really crop up in the United States. So it's the longer drawn-out operations which will allow time for a significant movement to develop to stop it. Now, Cuba is a special case. When they try to go against Cuba, they're going to find a lot of people under arms. The Cubans have something like 1.5 million people ready to mobilize at a moment's notice to fight alongside the regular forces. And they have developed a doctrine there which is going to be regional defense by the people who are living in the various regions. And it won't be a pushover like Panama or like Grenada. That is something that I think would be a long drawn-out affair, and that certainly many Americans would oppose. Just less than 2 weeks ago, the various groups in solidarity with Cuba organized a rally in the Javits Convention Center in New York City. They filled it, and there were 2,000 or 3,000 people outside waiting to get in who could not even get in.
The media told us 10,000 outside.
Well, I read in the Herald Tribune that there were 10,000 counter-demonstrators, that is, anti-Castro demonstrators, and I don't know the true number. I wasn't there. But the fact that they could organize a meeting and fill the convention center in New York City shows that there is support for Cuba in this country. And particularly the purpose of this one was to drop the economic blockade. That is also, of course, designed to hurt the civilian population of Cuba. And as in Iraq, they erroneously believe, falsely believe, that this will turn people against the revolution or against the government, as they do in Iraq by keeping these UN sanctions going. That's not going to happen, and the Cubans will certainly resist. The Cubans have resisted for more than 100 years dominance by the United States. They know their own history quite well. And although there are those who drop out and who come to the United States or who become dissidents in Cuba, that's a natural phenomenon. It happens everywhere. You can't talk about Cuba without comparing it to the rest of Latin America. It always has to be in that Latin American context. And as I have spent 30 years now following events in Latin America, and I lived them there for something like 12 years in Latin America, most of it in the CIA, I can compare and keep in mind all the time, and we all should do this, that Cuba is Latin America, and that they have made more progress in terms of education and social development than any other Latin American country. Their population is better educated than the United States population. They have a lower infant mortality rate than the cities of the United States. They have a national health care system which is free to everybody. And so they have a healthy population. And they are going through a very difficult period right now, and they need our support. That is to say also that the Salvadorans need our support. We have to support the work of CISPES now that the war is over, because there's going to be a transition period here in El Salvador, or there in El Salvador, which is extremely important for the future of that country. And naturally we should be in solidarity too in these activities with the Guatemalans, because that is a horrible situation. It has been for many, many years, thanks to intervention by the United States through the CIA in the 1950s. So there are many things to do. And the solidarity movement is also one way to try to help prevent wars and keep people together and mobilized or ready to mobilize to stop the next one. But we have to be very careful. Already there are predictions in the press. These pundits and columnists in Washington especially are predicting that Bush is going to try to do something by April or May. Because if he waits any longer and tries in September or August, it's going to be too obvious what he's doing.
What's really interesting, as I started out talking about in this our short time together, is that instead of working with our generation, with the generation from the 50s and 60s, you have chosen to focus on student activism as a place where the path is crossed. You know, the only place that we could confront the CIA is on campus. So can you talk a little bit about the militarization of academia and the CIA being on campus, and why you've decided to focus on the young?
Well, for one thing, the campuses are practically the only place where one can confront the CIA physically. You can't do that at Langley very well, although there have been some demonstrations there. But normally they go about their work in a quiet way. And the campuses are practically the only place where they actually come and say, we are CIA people, we're here to recruit. And their work is so incompatible with what a university should stand for in terms of truth and openness and so forth, that it's a proper place to confront them. And as I have decided that political education on the campuses is an extremely important thing, having been recruited myself by the CIA in the 50s, having gone into the CIA in the 50s.
You were recruited on a college campus in the 50s?
Yes, I was recruited in my senior year at the University of Notre Dame. I was 21 years old. I had no political education at all from my experience in university. No one like myself had ever come to speak to us as university students. And so because of the nature of higher education in the United States, and lower education for that matter, which is to produce a conformist citizen, one who will accept the system as it is and not make any waves or significant waves, because that is what the educational system is designed to do. People have to get into that educational system somehow, and there are plenty of faculty members all over the United States who are giving the other side of the coin, that is, the making alternative interpretations of the social, economic, political system in the United States and in other countries available. And I'm simply trying to add to what they are doing as full-time members of academia. I happen to have the experience to fall back on, and I spent some 20 years now studying and following this and writing about it. So I have a certain expertise that I like to put at the disposition of people who need it and who should have it. That is the reason why I am doing this in these universities. It's also because I enjoy it very much. I enjoy being in contact with students and with faculty. It's stimulating to me. It's energizing, even though when you go around constantly like this, it gets to be kind of tiring as well. But it is really a very enjoyable activity.
One could say that that Carnegie Mellon is guilty of corrupting the morals of minors, and it's really interesting that a university would even be named after Carnegie and Mellon, you know, two very wealthy people that have ruined a lot of people's lives. What advice would you give directly to somebody who was a Carnegie Mellon student wanting to find out about the CIA on their campus and their recruitment?
Well, I would recommend a book or two, you know. I would recommend Bill Bloom's The CIA, A Forgotten History, where he cites chapter and verse from the very beginning of the CIA's existence. I would recommend my own books, for example, on the CIA. I would recommend reading the Covert Action Information Bulletin on the agency. This is a publication. It's a quarterly. I mean, it's a quarterly, yes, which I helped to found back in 1978, and the magazine is excellent quality. I would suggest that a person do the reading first, and then make an informed decision on whether they would really want to get involved in this kind of activity. There are people who come to see me at my meetings when I go to different universities who are already in the CIA, on a CIA scholarship, for example. They have come up to me and said, Mr. Agee, I had no idea that the CIA is doing this, and I already have a scholarship for them. What can you tell me? You know? And others who are considering going in, they've perhaps taken exams or they've had interviews and they've heard me speak about what's going on. And the CIA never tells the people about this, you know. I remember very well at the University of Rhode Island, the policy there was that if 300 students sign a petition requesting a public presentation by any institution coming to recruit, that this institution would have to send someone to do a public presentation on the institution itself. In this case, it was the CIA. And I was due to speak at a rally against CIA recruiting on the steps of the Student Union building there at noon a particular day. But I made it a point to get there the night before for this public presentation. And the CIA man, his name was Arthur Hulnick, he was on stage debating a representative from the ACLU. The students had wanted me to do the debate, but the CIA will not get on the same stage with me. And I sat in the audience. I came in quietly in the back. Nobody knew I was there, but the meeting for the next day, the rally, was already announced and everything. So after the debate, there were microphones in the aisles, and I walked down to the microphone, introduced myself. I would be speaking the next day, and I asked the CIA representative, I said, Mr. Hulnick, I have heard you speaking, and you haven't mentioned a word about the CIA's liaison operations with the Salvadoran security services. These are the ways in which the CIA is giving them guidance and information and equipment and training and so forth, which is to say that they are in bed with the death squads in El Salvador. This was about 1988 or so. And you know that these death squads have caused the deaths in the most horrible ways of something like 75,000 people over 12 years. I said, Mr. Hulnick, how do you justify this activity? Why don't you tell us exactly what the CIA is doing down there right now with their officers working with the security and intelligence services of the Salvadoran government and military? You know what his answer was? Well, I'm very sorry about that. The Congress knows everything we are doing. We are an established agency of the U.S. government, legally established by Congress. And as far as El Salvador goes, I'm sorry, I can't talk about classified information. And everyone yelled out, answer the question, and so forth. But he just wouldn't answer it. And he didn't deny it at all, but he said, I'm sorry, I can't talk about classified matters. So everybody knew, of course, that what I had said about this activity, and what I've written about, of course, in the past, is actually going on. And that is one of the most grisly activities that the CIA is involved in, with these local security services that sometimes they have established themselves, such as I mentioned the SAVAK in Iran, but that was repeated all over the world. And I was working with these services when I was in the CIA in Latin America, and I know how horrible they can be.
I'd like to end our time here on a personal note. We used to have hundreds and hundreds of people working with us here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, against the Iraqi war. And now we have 4 or 5 people left. I think the 5th person's a little reluctant. But I'm wondering, we could probably do another half an hour video on how the CIA has made hell of your life in terms of passports, in terms of trying to interfere with your life, in terms of plotting against your life. I mean, for students whose activism is lucky to last for 6 months or a year, could you speak about a little bit about your longevity and your consistency over the years? What is it that gives you hope in the face of insurmountable odds?
Well, taking a leaf out of the procedures at AA, I could say my name is Philip, and I am a recovering Jesuit student, and have been ever since I was a teenager, because I went to a Jesuit high school. And that is a formative period, and one of the things I came away from in that education was a desire to devote my life to recognizing the way things are and the way things ought to be, or could be, and working to close the gap between what is and what should be the situation. And that is one of the reasons why I left the CIA. That is one of the reasons why I've done all the things I've done through these years. And it is a kind of personal philosophy which keeps me going. I mean, that's not going to help everyone else, but it is a fact that the system in the United States is not going to change unless people change it. It is a system which serves the interests of a very few people, relatively speaking. It is a system which marginalizes a huge proportion of the population. A third of the people in this country are destined for no hope of ever realizing the so-called American dream. That's the way the system is. And as I said in my talk last night, I believe the only real long-term solution is to rewrite the Constitution, to get enough people elected, progressive people on the state level, to bring about 2/3 of the states requesting a constitutional convention. This is under Article 5 of the Constitution. And then to rewrite the Constitution in such a way that the most fundamental human rights are written into it. The right to life, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to proper medical care, and so forth and so on, the right to a job. And then go on from there. This is not something that's going to happen perhaps in my lifetime. It will have to happen sooner or later, though, because the situation is just getting worse. And people eventually will say, I'm fed up, I'm not going to take it any longer, and get themselves organized. So I would simply say that on a personal level, my philosophy has always been to try to make things better and to participate in such a way that I can do that. Other people, I would say, ought to realize that we need you, and we want you, and you'll find a home, a great group of people with which to deal, and that we don't always have to win in order to be satisfied with what we're doing. We do it because it's the right and proper thing to do, whether we win or lose, And unfortunately, there are not enough people who are doing it from that conviction. And since there was so much disillusion following the beginning of the war, and then in the aftermath so many people falling away and not staying organized to stop the next one, that was a big mistake. And I think all those people who went out there marching ought to reconsider and ought to get involved again so that they can participate in preventing this next war that Bush is liable to start just to get himself reelected.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. Again, this is Vincent Irene for Peace TV. We've had the privilege of...
Sit over there next to him.
We've had the privilege of having Philip with us here at Carnegie. Again, thank you very much, Philip, for coming, for your company the last 2 days. It's been a real privilege to have you here with us to be encouragement to the peace community here in Pittsburgh, and especially to the young budding activist at Carnegie Mellon University. It's always a privilege to be with someone who has not gained or cashed in on his popularity from the 60s, but continues to speak out for the poor, starving people throughout the world that we continue to call our enemy and kill. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vince. I'm very happy to be here, and I'd be glad to come back at any time. I hope you'll ask me to come back.
Sure.
Just one more question.
Okay.
You know, you started off your speech last night. It's like, we have the worst leaders, the most corrupt system. Now, is it that the American people, as a people, are corrupt? I mean, they vote for George Bush, they vote for corrupt murderers, you know, for their presidents and for their leaders. You know, how do we change this, or why is this? What's your analysis of this?
Well, in terms of the election of the president, you know, it's about a quarter of the electorate which elected Bush, because he got about half of half, right? So it's not that many people who elected Bush. And one of the problems, of course, is to get people involved in politics. What serves the interests of reaction in the United States and for a continuation of the injustices that are around us all over the place is fatalism. And that is one of the traits of the political scene in third world countries. It is where people feel that they can't do anything, that they have to, the system of rewards and punishments is such that if they get out there and try to work to change things, to get involved politically, they are going to fall victim to the punishment side of this system. And that's the situation right here at Carnegie Mellon, apparently, from what people have been telling me, that many faculty members might feel reluctant about such things as these computer programs for bombing runs and targeting and bomb damage assessment and so forth. That plenty of faculty people would be opposed to that, but they're afraid of for their own jobs. And in a period just like that, just like this one of recession, and that's one of the reasons why recessions happen. They don't just happen on their own, but they happen to keep people under control, because people don't want to lose their jobs. They have to provide for their families. That is one of the reasons why, of course, people in certain sectors are not out there working to change the system. I don't have the final answer on that, I want to confess, but I think that fatalism is one thing, selfishness is another, lack of political understanding is still another, lack of hope that one can really be effective and make a difference is another reason, and the very practicalities of everyday life. I can remember in the CIA, for example, that it was very difficult for me to leave because I had 2 young sons and I had to provide for their support. There are other people who stay in the CIA maybe 15 years longer than they would want to, but they're stuck. They've got children to educate, they've got house payments to make, car payments to make, and so forth. And so as a practical matter, the way the system works, it is not easy to become a political activist and stick with it and take all the risks that are involved. But I would simply say it's certainly worth it, and you feel like you're doing something that's at least honest.
Come get out of the way, boys, quick get out of the way. You'd better watch what you say, boys, better watch what you say. We've rammed in your harbor and tied to your port, and our pistols are hungry and our tempers are short. So bring your daughters around to the fort, 'cause we're the cops of the world, boys, we're the cops of the world. We pick and choose as we please, boys, pick and choose as we please. You'd best get down on your knees, boys, best get down on your knees. We're hairy and horny and ready to shack, and we don't care if you're yellow or black. Just take off your clothes and lay down on your back, 'cause we're the cops of the world, boys. We're the cops of the world. Our boots are needing a shine, boys. Boots are needing a shine. But our Coca-Cola is fine, boys. Coca-Cola is fine. We've got to protect all our citizens fair, so we'll send a battalion for everyone there, and maybe we'll leave in a couple of years. 'Cause we're the cops of the world, boys. We're the cops of the world. And dump the Reds in a pile, boys. Dump the Reds in a pile. You'd better wipe off that smile, boys. Better wipe off that smile. We'll spit through the streets of the cities we wreck, and we'll find you a leader that you can elect. Those treaties we signed were a pain in the neck. 'Cause we're the cops of the world, boys. We're the cops of the world. And clean the Johns with a rag, boys. Clean the Johns with a rag. If you like, you can use your flag, boys. If you like, you can use your flag. We've got too much money, we're looking for toys. And guns will be guns, and boys will be boys. But we'll gladly pay for all we destroy. 'Cause we're the cops of the world, boys. We're the cops of the world. Please stay off of the grass, boys. Please stay off of the grass. Here's a kick in the ass, boys. Here's a kick in the ass. We'll smash down your doors, we don't bother to knock. We've done it before, so why all the shock? We're the biggest and the toughest kids on the block. And we're the cops of the world, boys. We're the cops of the world. And when we butchered your sons, boys, when we butchered your sons, have a stick of our gum, boys. Have a stick of our bubble gum. We own half the world, oh say can you see? And the name for our profits is democracy. So like it or not, you will have to be free. 'Cause we're the cops of the world, boys. We're the cops of the world.